9 p.m., October 10th, 1933. Farmers in northern Indiana look up at a sound no American has ever heard before. An airliner is exploding in midair, tearing apart as it falls. 7 people are about to die, and the person who did it is about to get away with the first crime of its kind in history. In the autumn of 1933, air travel was still new. Only a handful of Americans had ever left the ground. The plane carrying them was the newest thing in the sky. A Boeing 247. It was the most modern airliner in the world. All metal, streamlined, faster than anything then flying. United Airlines flew it clear across the country, from Newark to Oakland in a single day. To fly aboard it was to touch the future. On the afternoon of the 10th of October, the aircraft lifted off from Newark. By nightfall, it had reached Ohio and turned toward Chicago. 7 souls were aboard. A newly married captain of 25, his co-pilot beside him, a company radio man riding home off duty, 3 passengers with people waiting for them, and a young stewardess named Alice Scribner. She was 26, a trained nurse from Chicago. She was recently engaged. Her fiancé was waiting at the airport that night. She had begun flying this exact route only 9 days before. This was United Airlines Flight 23, a routine evening run to Chicago. Nothing about it seemed remarkable. They settled in for the final leg. And behind them sat something that should not have been there. None of them knew it. Earlier that same day, the flight had lifted out of Newark, on time, at 4:30 in the afternoon. It was a scheduled leg of United's transcontinental service, the long overnight run bound for Oakland. In the early evening, it touched down at Cleveland, Ohio, to take on fuel. There, the crew changed hands, as it always did on the long routes. Captain Richard Tarrant, 25 and newly married, took the controls for the leg into Chicago. During the stop, one passenger, a man named Emil Smith, stepped off the plane. He took with him a brown paper package about the length of a shoe. He kept it close to his body, walked the tarmac a few minutes, then reboarded and moved toward the front. The ground crew serviced the aircraft carefully and noted nothing at all unusual. At 3 minutes before 8, the plane climbed away from Cleveland as Trip 23. Its small load of cargo and all its baggage rode in the forward compartment only. The rear compartment, everyone believed, held nothing but the stewardess's spare pillows. That belief, it turned out, was wrong. The flight was running about 15 minutes late, pushing into a steady headwind. At 39 minutes past 8, the crew made what should have been a routine radio call. They were passing over the town of North Liberty, Indiana, at 1,500 feet. 2 beacon lights were in view, and the ceiling above them was clear. Everything aboard, the crew reported, was okay. It was the very last word anyone would ever hear from them. The report that should have followed a few minutes later simply never came. A United pilot flying a following trip nearby saw a sudden flash of fire in the dark. He did not yet realize that he was watching Trip 23 fall from the sky. On the ground near Chesterton, farmers heard a hard, flat explosion somewhere overhead. They looked up and saw the airliner already burning, at about 1,000 feet. As they watched in horror, the aircraft began to come apart in the air. The tail and part of a wing broke away from the body of the plane. What remained of the plane fell out of the sky, wrapped in flames. It came down in a farm field in Jackson Township, Porter County, several miles to the east of Chesterton, out in the open dark. The wreckage burned where it fell, its ignition switch found afterward still in the on position. 5 of the 7 aboard were found that very same night. The last 2 were recovered the following day, half a mile from the main wreckage. For all 7, death had come in a single instant, high above a dark Indiana field, within a single day. the Bureau of Investigation, the agency that would one day become the FBI, opened a case. Taking personal charge of the investigation in Chicago was a young special agent named Melvin Purvis. He was not yet 30, and still a year away from the fame that would follow the Dillinger case. For now, he stood in a burned-out Indiana field, trying to read the story hidden in the wreckage. The first thing that troubled the investigators was where the tail of the plane had come to rest. It lay far from the rest of the plane. Reports in the file range from 600 feet to nearly a mile. However far it was, the meaning was the same. The tail had left the plane before it hit the ground. Something had torn the aircraft open while it was still in flight. Then came the evidence of the twisted metal itself. The torn edges of the metal fragments were curled outward, not crushed inward. Metal bends outward like that only when a force pushes out from inside it. Something had exploded within the body of the plane, pressing the walls violently out. The investigators then turned to the fuel tanks to test the single most obvious explanation. If leaking fuel vapor had ignited, the tanks themselves would show the same outward blast. Instead, the tanks were crushed inward, the clear mark of impact with the ground. The fire, in other words, had come after the fall to Earth, not before it. A fuel explosion could now be ruled out completely. Purvis mapped the pattern of the blast, and the debris told a clear story. Everything forward of one single compartment had been thrown forward. Everything behind that compartment had been thrown backward, and the sides of it had been blown outward. Every line of force pointed back to a single origin. The rear baggage compartment, tucked near the lavatory bulkhead at the back of the cabin. The very same compartment that was supposed to hold nothing but pillows. In 1933, the Bureau still had no forensic laboratory of its own, so the Bureau borrowed one. The recovered debris was sent to the Crime Detection Laboratory at Northwestern University. Its chemists examined the debris and found the signature of a high explosive, something of the kind of nitroglycerin, dynamite, TNT, or a similar substance. The Army Ordnance Department, examining the evidence separately, arrived at the very same conclusion. A bomb had been placed in or very near the rear baggage compartment. It was, as far as the records show, the first proven bombing of a commercial airliner anywhere in history. The science of aviation bomb forensics was born in that burned-out Indiana field. With the cause of the blast established, the investigation turned to the only question that truly mattered. Who, the first and by far the most investigated lead, was the passenger Emil Smith. He was the man with the brown paper package that he never once let out of his sight. He also carried a small rifle and cartridges, which seemed damning enough at first. But the rifle turned out to have an entirely innocent explanation. Smith belonged to a Chicago gun club and was on his way to a shooting competition. Agents dug into his finances, his associates, and even a woman he had reportedly quarreled with. They found no motive, no trace of a bomb, and no crime of any kind. In the end, they concluded that he was, indeed, in their words, simply a reputable citizen. And yet the package itself was never explained. Its contents were never determined, and it remains the single loose thread the Bureau itself admitted in the file. Other theories rose and then fell away one by one. One of them pointed straight toward the Chicago underworld. This was the era of prohibition gangsters, and several notorious names lived in the same area. One passenger had ridden the same route just days earlier, from the very same suburb as those men. But proximity alone is not evidence, and the mob theory was never developed. Another theory held that the bomb had been meant for one specific passenger. A single targeted killing, hidden inside a mass one. That idea would return later in this story, in a form almost no one expected. There was also the matter of United's own restless pilots. In the autumn of 1933, United's pilots were locked in an active pay dispute. A few loose remarks about trouble and agitation were flagged and followed up. None of it ever produced any real evidence of sabotage. Tarrant and Ruby themselves had refused to join the agitating faction of pilots. Beyond all of that, agents cast an extraordinarily wide net. They tracked down nearly everyone who had booked, boarded, or canceled a seat on that route. Across a 10-day window around the crash, every cancellation turned out to be ordinary. For business reasons only. The file repeats that same explanation again and again. The physical evidence, all the while, was quietly slipping away. The wreckage itself was sold to a junk dealer and hauled off the very day after the crash. Souvenir hunters had already picked over the field before the first inspector even arrived. Director Hoover pressed hard for results, growing more impatient with every passing month. But the case file grew past 300 pages, with no suspect ever named, no one charged, and no motive established. The case was formally closed in the autumn of 1935, 2 years on. All undeveloped leads in the case, Hoover wrote, had been exhausted. And there, the whole story sat, largely forgotten, for more than 80 years. Then, in November of 2017, the FBI finally declassified the case file. 324 pages, released to the American public at last. Most of what the file held confirmed what was already known. But buried inside was something the public had never once seen. It was a single memo from the spring of 1934. It concerned a senior official named Joseph Keenan. Keenan was an assistant attorney general of the United States government. At the time, he was prosecuting some of the era's most notorious kidnapping cases. He had made powerful enemies, and just 2 days before the crash, he had ridden this very same route himself. Not the doomed flight itself, but the same run, only 2 days earlier. And so the Bureau itself asked a genuinely chilling question. What if the bomb had actually been meant for Keenan? What if it had simply been placed aboard the wrong flight by mistake? Agents were ordered to identify every last passenger on that earlier trip, to make certain that no one aboard had planned an attack on him. The manifest of that earlier flight held yet another famous name. A young Adlai Stevenson, a future presidential candidate, had been aboard that trip. But the Keenan theory, like every other before it, led nowhere at all. No plot against him was ever proven. And the oldest question of them all still remained completely unanswered. What exactly had been inside the package that Emil Smith carried? The Bureau's own final summary admitted it had never been explained. That is exactly where the trail goes cold for good. 7 people died in the air over an Indiana field on that October night. The evidence had proved beyond any doubt that someone put a bomb aboard. And yet that someone was never named, never charged, and never found. The first person ever to bomb an airliner was also the first to get away with it. The file is public now, all 324 pages of it, waiting. So read it for yourself and tell me, who do you think did it?